Thank you, Ashley. My name is John Phillips. I'm research lead at Tessian. I'm excited to kick off today's session by focusing on the latest research from our Global State of Email Security report that will be released shortly. We have a fantastic panel lined up. We have Anuj Tawari, CISO of TMF Group. We also have Ram Ganeshanathan, VP of Enterprise Security at ARM. Gentlemen, welcome to today's discussion. We know that email security is becoming a big challenge in the enterprise, and we've got some research that backs it up. We did a study where we interviewed 600 security leaders across EMEA and North America, and some of the findings were surprising. The first statistic that we're delving into is email impersonation attacks are the number one concern for security, the number one security concern for organizations. Anuj, why are impersonation attacks becoming such a concern for organizations?
Great question, John. Impersonation attacks, I think, are getting a lot of attention from adversaries, especially, is because I think adversaries are very quickly realizing that instead of breaking into complex ways into environments, trying to deploy complex payload and get into AP type environments, just ask people what you need. Just ask them for their password or an invoice or a payment. And more than not, people will do that. So I think impersonation in terms of the adversaries trying to impersonate a vendor or their CEO or somebody from the leadership or a trusted person like their HR partner or a provider like their network provider is becoming more and more common because I think the whole impersonation lies on the art of trust. And I think that implied trust is there. So this is becoming a very quick way of getting information or getting the, people to do like a click on a link or something that the adversaries want them to do.
I love that, Anuj. I agree. And Rem, from your perspective, how have you seen impersonation attacks evolve over time in your environment?
Yeah, I would really echo everything Anu just mentioned in terms of the volume that we're seeing. It's really driven far more now by impersonation attacks and account takeovers than I've seen, in previous years. And I think it's just because it's so much more successful. Why would you spend the time and money and investment in all these other complicated ways when actually there is that implied and inherent trust that comes with, people trusting a trusted colleague or vendor and so on and so forth. And also, I think there's a little bit of digital fatigue. Everything is so interconnected in your personal lives, your work life. Expecting people to be so vigilant all of the time it's taxing, to be entirely honest with you. And I think you can't ask people, or you can't reasonably expect people to be on the top of their game all of the time. So I think this is why this is really a growing threat vector that we all need to be aware of.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially given the amount of data that we're working with in today's environment. We're also working in increasingly distributed working environments. People are fatigued, and all it takes is one user error, and then you're compromised. Moving over to our second stat that is from our research, it talks about attack surface size and the challenges that organizations are having with the smaller the organization, obviously the less the size of your attack surface. But Ram, do enterprises, how do they address attack surface risk with the new hybrid and remote operating models that we're now working to?
Yeah, really timely question, right? I think hybrid working and remote working is kind of the new way of working for the majority of organizations. And I think COVID has really forced companies to adopt that. And what that means for us from a cybersecurity perspective is we also need to adapt. So I think the main thing that organizations need to do is make sure that the controls they have across their estate and environment can be applied in a remote environment. So they're not solely applicable to a physical presence in the office, right? So that means you need to be able to still monitor your device, your user logins, all of that kind of stuff. And most organizations can largely do this. So if actually you have the same level of controls that you do, regardless of where the individual or the device is connected to, I think that's a significant step forward and an important one. But I think the real risk and concern that comes with this kind of hybrid working is really the intermingling of one's personal life and their work life, right? People are not doing a 9 to 5 necessarily at home. They might be doing an 8 to 9 and figure out which hours work for them. And they may be choosing to access their personal email on their work email device and so on and so forth. And actually, you're now, or if you think of that Venn diagram, you kind of have this overlapping period where actually people's personal lives and digital presence is now at risk of bringing in security threats into an organization. I think that's a really interesting dynamic that we necessarily haven't faced in the same volume and scale in previous years. And that's why it's so important to be able to have controls and detection capability that is able to look for anomalous activity, because there is no baseline, right? There is no 9 to 5 of what is normal for one individual may look very different for somebody else. So being able to detect anomalous activity anywhere in the world, whether it's at home or in the office, is going to be really key, so that you can anticipate when a threat actor has been able to take over an account and so on and so forth. And all of this to say is people are still people, they're still individuals, and we want to treat them personally. But what we're talking about from threat perspective, these are digital identities, and they may be taken over by a threat actor. And to be able to distinguish that, we need to be able to separate, the unique individuals and people that we care about in our workforce versus a digital identity that could be a trusted employee or it could be a threat actor.
I love that, Ram. I really like how you broke that down and the importance of focusing on those identities. Anuj, from a organization size perspective, do organizations need to vary their cybersecurity defense strategy based on the size of the organization?
That's an interesting question. And I think over the last 2 years, especially, and I'm going to pick up on what Ram said about hybrid working and COVID really transforming things, I'm going to take that context essentially. So, what has really been happening is I think in the past, we have all been used to strategies like defense in depth. Which don't really exist anymore. The borders are very quickly dissolving, right? Identity is the new perimeter, as the cliche has been going around in the industry. So I don't think we need to kind of scale back or scale up the controls, if you will. In my opinion, what really matters is that we reconfigure the controls. We reconfigure the control around people, around identities, and around devices. And of course, and I'm literally talking through the simple zero trust principles. And we are also part of that journey. And we are looking at things like SASE being the new parameter. And so essentially moving your controls over to a unified layer and making sure that there is visibility into what employees' behavior is while they are away in this new normal, because everybody is building that baseline, if you will, right now. And I think that's going to become very important as tools are adopting to its AI and machine learning kind of capability. So I think that's really coming in handy, which in a way can help in the long term scale back the controls and use more managed services of, if you will, in that context.
I think fantastic advice. And I agree with you, Anuj, that zero trust is really gaining that mainstream adoption now, and it's critically important. Gentlemen, the next topic, ransomware. We know that ransomware is a perennial problem. It's a growing security challenge, and email represents that vector for initial access. Let's talk about, Anuj, the growing ransomware challenge. What are you seeing? Why is email such a preferred channel for ransomware delivery?
Very interesting, because when the ransomware started, it was all about deploying some sort of a payload or a beacon to start with to get some sort of foothold. And I remember back in the days of WannaCry and something, when the ransomware was really hitting the mainstream, we were focused a lot around the proxy or email type traffic, because that's where typically most of the things were coming from. Then came the evolution of sending attachments via email, which also people got educated about. So people are not clicking as much macros and all. And the adversaries are thinking, how do we get in now? The beauty of using an email is there is no payload. So the defense systems kind of get bypassed on their own, and it's difficult for a user to, once they start engaging, they can be pivoted off to a different environment, like a different website or a trusted email, which they think is safe, and essentially breach the environment. So again, playing with the human psychology and not trying to fight the great defense systems that are out there from a cybersecurity standpoint. So I think it makes absolute sense for adversaries to adopt a vector like email to do the initial breach.
I love that, Anuj. I agree with you. And I think it's that open architecture of email that just makes it so attractive for threat actors to exploit. Ram, from your perspective, what are you seeing and what do you think as a security leader, how the ransomware challenge will evolve over the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, it's interesting, right? Ransomware has been present, but certain for a long time. But actually, the publicity and number of organizations that are getting hit, as well as the media coverage that comes with it, is just booming really at the moment. And actually, I think that will just grow and grow, right? So in reality, in the simplest terms, I think we'll see more of it, and I think we'll see more coverage of it, and I think it will become a more accessible subject to society and the public because of how it impacts them day to day, whether that be their local grocery store, their bank, or where they work. I think we just need to accept there will be an increased volume of victims, unfortunately, right? And that's not a defeatist attitude. That I think is the reality of the threat environment and how quickly all of the companies in the world, not everyone is going to have the resources to be able to scale up their defenses and hire the skills they need and so on and so forth. But I think what we will definitely see in time is a greater focus on what I think has been possibly the less sexy part of cybersecurity that's business continuity and operational resilience, right? So what is your backup strategy? So almost as an assuming we will get compromised at some point. How do we back up and recover as quickly as possible? How do we minimize the disruption to our organization, to our employees, to our vendors, depending where you are in the supply chain and what your organization does? I think there will be far more focus on continuity than there has been historically, because now we're beginning to understand that ransomware is kind of here to stay, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ram. I think the focus on cyber resilience is critical, and if there's one positive outcome from this scourge that we're facing, it's that businesses and organizations become more cyber resilient. The next topic, and Ram, a question for you. We're seeing credential compromise, multi-factor authentication, credential compromise reaching record highs. A number of large enterprises have been hit this year. There was one statistic, over 10,000 organizations that use Microsoft suffered a credential-related compromise. What is needed in organizations to harden their cyber defenses to ensure an additional layer of security, behind the credential?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think multi-factor authentication, I think hopefully most of the audience are familiar with it and are using them in their organization. If they're not, I'd say absolutely, two-factor authentication is absolutely critical in today's age for any enterprise, almost regardless of size. And employ that in your personal lives as well, right? And whether it be your social media and so on and so forth. I think it's just becoming so critical nowadays. Now, there are lots of things that organizations can do, and you kind of need to make a judgment call on what works best for your organization. So there's password rotation, which is not as popular. You can use physical keys for authentication. You can do, I've been in organizations that have even used, thumbprints, and you've got iris scanners and so on and so forth. But actually, I think it's all about proportionality and what is right for your organization, right? So having two forms of authentication, whether it be a password and something else, a key or otherwise, is really important. But again, people use the same password for various things. That is the reality of how many people, not all people, of course, and we educate them not to do so. But by being a security practitioner, what we understand is not everyone will choose to follow our guidance, and that's absolutely fine. But how do we then account for that? In that means that we need to prepare for a credential leak, right? We can do all the preparation prevention work, but actually, how do you then quickly identify that a user has given up their credentials, right? Because they've been phished, for example. How do we detect that? Do we have the threat intelligence retrospectively to say, actually, we know somebody in our environment has accessed a known malicious page? And then secondly, if it has been leaked, how do we identify? Do we have dark web monitoring? There are free resources such as Have I Been Pwned, which are fantastic resources that can be used. So at least you know what credentials of yours are out there, and you can almost create a bank. So you know which credentials you've already responded to and already changed, because they will keep coming up in all numerous breaches. And then thirdly is being able to identify when they are actually being used by a potential threat actor. As I mentioned earlier, if you look at this digital identity, they look the same as potentially a trusted employee, right? So yes, the multi-factor authentication is really important, but for some of your more complex and mature organizations, having that anomalous detection is going to be really key. And applying it in a way that works for your organization's culture, right? Every single organization will want to use this in a different way depending on their, what they're historically used to, and also how far forward they are for adopting new technology and innovation in the space.
Thanks, Ram. I think that's really sage advice. And Anuj, I want you to touch on a point that Ram mentioned. He mentioned threat intelligence. Why is there a need for a new approach to threat intelligence? Let's call it a behavioral-based approach to threat intelligence. Why are we seeing the demand for behavioral-based cybersecurity solutions growing?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so like I was saying prior, essentially prior solutions or our past really was solutions which used to integrate and talk to each other well. We were able to bind them by a location, by a firewall, for example, or an internet connection. Today, there is no boundary. So what's really happening is the signals that are coming to the security operations or from a monitoring standpoint are getting a little bit weaker than what we used to see in the past because there is a lot of noise. For example, there used to be this use case around impossible travel, but it's so easy to see employees accessing, let's say, using some sort of a web proxy, and you're suddenly seeing them after connecting to a VPN connect from a different country altogether. We operate in 80 countries, for example, and some of those use cases are throwing absolute alarms which are not consumable in the SOC. They're mostly false positives. So what's really, I think, happening is we've got to move away from purely security rule-based technologies, which can in a binary fashion allow or disallow or make security decisions, but really move towards enriching that data with the human element, which is the real person behind that machine or behind that computer. Yeah, so you've got to enrich those signals. I think that's the first key priority in trying to understand how the attack actually happened. And in a technology term, if you were to map it back to a kill chain, so you've got to really shift some of these things left. Fortunately, unfortunately, I'm trying to think of it. It's my eighth year as a CISO for a large firm which has more than 120 offices and whatnot. And I can tell you, I've been reading these reports from Verizon's and the Mandiants of the world. The detection of the adversary still continues to be over 180 days. And this metric somehow have not changed. Now, if you really think about it, can some of these things be identified sooner if we have more regression type methodologies from AI where user behavior is captured? So, no doubt, I think some of these things have proven very good in a few use cases in terms of having a user based detection and trying to weed out what usually would not get the alarms and the bells tickle. For example, account takeover. For example, email forwarding, ATOs, and the list keeps going on and on. So I think that's a good use case, and it's something that is still being progressing in the industry. So the maturity and of the technology itself and the adoption is something that is scaling up as we speak.
I love that, Anuj. I think the importance of risk-based prioritization that you mentioned is only going to grow, and the ability to detect threats as they arise proactively rather than sitting with it, a forensic triage situation where you're looking at the incident, and like you say, it takes 180 days in many other cases to detect actual breach. Our last topic, gentlemen, we're talking about data loss. Let's focus on data loss, the other side of the coin. We always focus on breaches, threat actors coming from outside. Often there's this notion of insider threats within the organization. We have some statistics to show that over 2/3 of organizations suffered a incident of an employee exfiltrating data. Anuj, why has data loss been solved for so poorly in today's environment?
I think when we say today's environment, I'm going to really take a look of it from the past 2 years, and I'm going to take again COVID as a pivot point. So I think what's happening is a lot of cloud adoption is happening. And when the cloud adoption is happening, so think of your emails moving from a static place to another. Think of your files moving from, again, a static file server hosted internally, controlled internally, moving over to the cloud, your storage moving over to the cloud, and the apps essentially modernizing itself for adoption of the SaaS types environments. Hence, where the data used to lie, which used to be the base premise. So, I mean, you can protect what you know. So, if you, a lot of these times, today's companies don't really know where the data is moving, unfortunately, or if it is still residing in both the places and in what form and fashion it exists. I think some of these things being moving away, we have lack of solutions which can cohesively look across homogeneous environments, which is what I think is causing a lot of data leakage issues today. The biggest one to call out is a shadow IT use case. Yeah, we sometimes even don't know we have people who have super administrative privileges and we can deploy all sort of controls, but until we have behavior monitoring in place, all the controls go for a toss. So a lot of interesting use cases out there, and I think again, the cyber industry from a tooling and solution standpoint is going to see a big pivot from now on. Now that all the data does not have a lot of boundaries these days.
I love that, Anuj. Ram, just touching off a point that Anuj just mentioned, the importance of visibility. Often we know that data loss is the problem that CISOs don't know they have, the extent of data loss. Just talk us through the importance of having visibility into both malicious and also accidental, negligent acts of data loss.
Yeah, I mean, data loss is at the moment, a top priority for most organizations. Data is king at the moment, right? And what data means will be different to different organizations in terms of the criticality of the data, right? So, if you're an intellectual property company, your IP might be important. If you work in a legal field, the details of contracts and your customers and vendors and sensitive information is going to be different. And actually understanding that the criticality and importance. So if you think about your critical assets or crown jewels, whatever an organization calls it, it is going to differ for various organizations depending on their business model ultimately. And it's really, really important that we understand where our data exists, the ones that we really care about, but also acknowledge that it can be transgressed and egressed, through any medium, essentially, right? As Anuj mentioned, cloud is boom, but a few years ago, it wasn't unheard of for people to take a pen drive and actually, plug it in and take their data off. And actually, there may be very little visibility from their security organization. Now you have drop and drag capability where you can just move something into Google Drive, and the log information that your SOC may use will be actually very limited. There's a greater adoption of CASB and all of these other things. So I think there's going to be a real technology change in terms of how we address this problem. But unless we truly understand where our data exists, as Anuj mentioned, but then also all the different mechanisms of how it is potentially able to leave the organization, you can't really tackle the problem in the meaningful sense. If you adopt a DLP solution that doesn't truly address or even identify the data that you think is valuable, then it's kind of a moot point. So that risk-based approach is going to be really important.
Thanks, Ram. I think that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank Ram and Anuj for joining me today. Over to you, Ashley. Thank you.